Miss Liz, tea time, yeah, making a difference, one cup at a time, tea time, yeah, Miss Liz, tea time, yeah, making a difference, one cup at a time, tea time, yeah. So be sure to grab your tea, grab a seat, and tune in to Miss Liz, tea time. Making a difference, one cup at a time. Tea time, yeah. Tea time, time.
Well, welcome, and we are back. It is evening tea time. We did this afternoon tea time, and now we're doing the evening tea time. This morning's tea time, there was a little glitch. We'll see how that goes in the future. But now we have the incredible Edward Willett, and he's an author, freelance writer, journalist, actor, singer, all of that good stuff. So we're going to share a good TEA with all of you guys tonight. So grab your tea, grab your coffee, glass of wine, beer. You do not need to drink tea when you're sitting with Miss Liz and having tea time, because we don't serve a beverage. We serve real life stories here on Tea Time with Miss Liz. So let me get the disclaimer out there, and then we're going to do a little bio intro, and then we're going to get Edward in here, and we're going to spill a good TEA tonight. So, disclaimer for Miss Liz's Tea Time live show. Miss Liz, myself, is going live using StreamYard. Before leaving a comment, please grant StreamYard permission to see your name at StreamYard.com. Please be advised that the content brought forward for any Tea Time show hosted by myself, Miss Liz, is always brought forward in good faith. However, may bring forward dialogues and opinions that are not representative of my platform. The facts and information are perceived to be accurate at the giving time of airing. All Tea Time guests and audience participants are responsible for using their good judgment in taking any action that may relate to the discussion. The content brought forward may include discussion for some where they may be emotionally at risk. It is significant to know that this show is engaging in discussion forums only to offer and inspire awareness and connection, and is not providing therapeutical advice. If you have any questions about the disclaimer or the panelist discussion, you may freely contact me, Miss Liz, through my email at bookingmissliz@gmail.com. Moving forward, should you choose to voluntarily participate in tonight's show in any aspect, I myself, Miss Liz, welcomes you. And should you decide that the show is not made for you at this time, I respect those wishes and will see you at a later date and a later show this year. Again, all tea times are done on a Thursday, 10 a.m., 3 p.m., and 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if it's done on a different day than Thursday, it's a rescheduled tea time, which will be a Monday or a Tuesday. So stay tuned for that. So a little bit now on my guests. I have Edward Willett, and we've been talking in the background, and he's written over 50 books of science fiction, fantasy, and nonfiction for adults, young adults, and children. He's won the best long form work in English in 2009, the second book in the Double Helix duology, Terra my guests are hard on me. I can't even pronounce it. I'm going to try my best, and if I say it wrong, I'll get Edward to help me here. Where was I? I'm getting there. The Double Helix duology, Terra Insegura, was shortlisted the following year. His young adult fantasy spirit singer won the Regina Book Award in 2002, Saskatchewan Book Awards, and several others of his novels have been shortlisted for Saskatchewan Book Awards. I want to talk to him about that shortlisted because I want to know more about that. Ed's 8th book, for DAW, DAW. The Cityborn came out in July, and he's currently working on a new fantasy series for the DAW entitled Worldshapers. Other recent titles include The Mask of, again, Ag, Agma trilogy for doll written as E.C. Blake, Flames of Nevyana. Oh my goodness, I'm having tongue twisters here, Edward. Oh my goodness. I'm going to have to get him to say these books because I can't pronounce them, and I'm so, so sorry. Fantasy from Rebelight Books, and the 5 books Shards of Excalibur. Oh, I got that word. Fantasy series for Coteau Books, of which doors into Faeries. I'm going to get him to say it. The concluding volume, like the second book in the series, Twist of the Blade, has been shortlisted for a biology to history. His most recent is Government House, Regina, Saskatchewan, and Illustrated History. And for more on Edward, we're going to get you to check out my Facebook page and my Instagram and all that good stuff. And I'm going to get Edward to come in here and share some of these words because I really don't like. I find that I'm making a butcher out of these words. So I'm going to get Edward to share these stories with all of us. So let me pop them in here. Welcome, Edward. I am so sorry. Like, I'm just like, what? How do you say that?
Yeah, that's one of the hazards of writing science fiction and fantasy, I guess. That's was kind of an old biography too. It was about 6 years in the past at this point, so there's a lot more since then. So.
Oh wow! So there's a lot more science fiction words that I probably couldn't even pronounce. Correct?
Actually, the last few probably weren't too bad. There was Worldshapers, so that was easy. The Moonlit World, that one's easy. Master of the World. So my last few titles, The Tangled Stars was my most recent one. So those titles were much simpler. You happened to pick the hardest ones with the weirdest names.
Right at the top. I'm like, what? What is saying here?
Yeah, Marseguro and Terra Insegura are both Portuguese of all things. And then, of course, Masks of Aygrima, that's just a made-up fantasy word. And Flames of Nevyana, that's another made-up fantasy word. So.
That's why I can't pronounce them, because they're made-up words, guys. So I don't feel so bad now. So, Edward, where did you come up with these words? Because I'm just like, I don't even know how to say it.
Well, I don't know. When you're writing, I mean, I've been a science fiction fantasy reader from a very early age. The very first short story I ever wrote, I was 11 years old, something to do on a rainy day. And it was, I was, about 11, probably might have been 10. It was called Castra Glass Hypership Test Pilot. So I was already making up weird names because I had it from having read science fiction as a kid. I thought, well, of course, everybody has weird names in science fiction. So I thought I had to make up weird names. And over the years, I don't know, I just play around with sounds that sound interesting in my mouth and seem to fit characters and places, and that's what I come up with. But it comes from being steeped in this stuff from a very early age.
Well, you really got my tongue twisted. Like, I'm just like, these are like tongue twisters. I can say it 5 times, even if I try 1 time. So what got you into science fiction, Edward?
Well, I have 2 older brothers, and they both read it, so it was around the house. I remember, I think the earliest science fiction book I can remember reading, there were a couple of them. One was called Danny Dunn and the Anti-Gravity Paint, I think it was called, or something like that. Danny Dunn was a whole series. There was there was also like Encyclopedia Brown and all these kind of series books. But Danny Dunn had science fiction aspects to it. I remember that one. And then I remember a book called Revolt on Alpha C. I actually have it on my desk here somewhere, which was written by Robert Silverberg, one of the great names in science fiction. When he was 19 years old, it was his first novel. And I read it when I was probably 10 or 11 or something. And again, it was because my older brother had it in the house. And I just latched onto it. It was strictly books. I did see Star Trek, but we didn't have, where we lived in rural Saskatchewan, we only got 2 channels, one of which was fuzzy. And Star Trek wasn't on them. So I saw Star Trek. I think it was already in reruns by the time I saw the original Star Trek. And I latched onto that, but I gravitated to it because I loved written science fiction. I didn't get into writing it because of media, because there just wasn't that much at the time. So
let's take you back a little bit, Edward. So as a little boy, how were you? Like, were you a curious little guy? Were you like a quiet guy? Were you in the corner just reading a book? Like, how were you as a little guy?
I was very much the reader. I actually learned to read it. My kindergarten teacher, this was in Lubbock, Texas, taught us the sounds of the words. I don't know if the word phonics was used or not, but that's what it was. She taught us the sounds that the words made, even though she wasn't teaching us to read, but she was getting us ready for reading. And I was so ready to read, I taught myself to read from what she taught me. So by the time I got to grade 1, I was already reading at the level that they expected you to read at in grade 1. And I remember I was in grade 1 for about 10 days and they bumped me up to grade 2. So I skipped grade 1. But that meant I was always the young, and I also had a summer birthday. So I was really the youngest kid in my class for my entire school career. So that probably made me a little more on the outskirts of what was going on with everybody else. I will say I was smart, but I was also maybe a smart aleck. Because I knew stuff that other people didn't know, including the teacher. And I wasn't shy about telling people that I knew something they didn't know. And it usually started with, I read somewhere that. And so that probably didn't win me a lot of friends. I mean, I had a few close friends, but I wasn't in the middle of the popular groups. I wasn't a sports kid at all. I was small. It's hard to believe now. I'm 6'2" now, but I was small then. And partly because I was a year younger than everybody. So I was usually smaller than people in the class. So I was always the last one chosen for sports. We moved up to Canada when I was 8 years old, and everybody around me knew how to skate, but I'd already missed the boat. At 8, you were way past where everybody was learning to skate around here. So hockey never appealed to me. I had flat feet too, so it was kind of painful. So I didn't really play any sports except for 1 year of high school football. I remember a disastrous experiment in Little League that was just awful. So I was very much the bookish type, and but also musical. I could sing. My dad was a choir director and music teacher, and I grew up in the Church of Christ, which is a church that has a cappella, unaccompanied congregational singing. That's the only music you have. So I sang hymns 3 times a week. And I started as a boy soprano, and then I became a boy alto, and then I sang tenor, and then I sang bass. So I sang all 4 parts, learned to harmonize, sang in choirs and all that. So I had that going for me. And about the same time I wrote my first short story, I also was in my first play. I played Petruchio in a 1-act adaptation of The Taming of the Shrew at the Weyburn Junior High in Weyburn, Saskatchewan. There's a picture of me in my little tights and my little tunic and my plastic sword. And I just loved that. So those 3 things, music and writing and theater, all kind of kicked in at about the same time. And so did art. I love to draw. So all of those are the kinds of things I was drawn to, but none of those are the kinds of things that made you center of the popular party types at school by any means.
Right? You weren't the football player or the cheerleader or all that cool stuff.
Well, I was a football player for that 1 year, but I remember somebody saying I was in a play, I think, and part of the play involved some poetry I had to recite, and so I was in the hallway, I think, reciting poetry, and I overheard, or somebody told somebody that then told me that they said, he's on the football team and he's reciting poetry in the hallway. So. But it was the kind of school where that was okay. I went to the school that my dad taught at, Western Christian College, and it was a high school, but it's called Western Christian College. And it was a very warm and comfortable place to be. So there wasn't bullying or a lot of that kind of stuff going on. So I was perhaps a little weird, but not ostracized like I might have been at a giant public high school.
So you're originally from New Mexico, if I remember right.
Born in Silver City, New Mexico. We were actually living in a little town called Baird, kind of right at the edge of the mountains in the desert. But we moved from there when I was 2. And then I grew up first in Lubbock, Texas for 4 years. That's where I started school. And then Tulia, Texas, these are both in the panhandle of Texas, the rectangular bit at the top. And then we just moved up we went straight up from there to Canada when I was 8 years old.
So have you ever been back to New Mexico?
I haven't. I was in New Mexico several years ago now. A World Science Fiction Convention happened to be in Denver. And we went down and made a point of going into New Mexico because it was the first time I'd been there in years and years and years. And when we came over the pass into New Mexico, it was all dry and kind of a drought in Colorado. But when we moved into New Mexico, on the other side of the pass we came over, had rained and it was green, and there was even a rainbow in the sky welcoming me back to the land of enchantment. So I felt, yeah, my mom always said that New Mexico was her favorite place she'd ever lived. And I really enjoyed the visit that we had there. We were in Albuquerque, I guess. No, Santa Fe. Santa Fe? Albuquerque. Santa Fe. We were in Santa Fe.
So is there any special recipes or anything that your mom made as a child that you still do?
Yes. She picked up something from someone called enchilada casserole, which is basically a kind of Mexican lasagna. So it's tortillas, meat sauce, cheese in layers, and then all baked. And Mexican casserole, we usually called it. And it was a standby. We had it for Christmas as often as not. And I've still made it a few times. It's still one of my absolute favorite things ever. So she picked it up, I think, when we were in New Mexico. I think that's when she got the recipe for it.
Oh, well, that's really cool. So all the listeners out there, like, I'd like to bring in tradition and foods and all that yummy stuff. So, it does go with tea. So I want to get into your tea, Edward, and then I want to get into some science fiction and some shortlisted and all of that good stuff, because I have a lot of questions here for you. So if I ask you what your tea is, what 3 words would you give me tonight?
I think I would say thinking, exploring, and acting.
Oh, okay. So do you want to tell me why you gave me those words?
I'm always thinking too much. There are times I wish I could quit thinking, but there's always a million things going through my head. And of course, writing science fiction and creating stuff out of nothing. You're not really creating it out of nothing. You're creating out of all the stuff that's gone into your head. So thinking is something I am constantly doing. I live in my head more than I live in the outside world, I think. As for exploring, what kind of ties in, I'm just interested in everything. I always have been. I was a newspaper reporter. And one of the great things about being a newspaper reporter is that you ask people questions and you find out about things that you wouldn't otherwise know about. And as an editor now and publisher, I'm reading stuff. I'm just publishing a book very soon that talks about logging. And I knew very little about what was involved. And I've just been fascinated by, well, first of all, how dangerous it is, but I've just been fascinated by the whole process. So exploring covers all of that, learning new things, and then thinking about them. So those two go together. And then acting is not just because I'm an actor, which is one of my favorite things. If I could do just one thing and I didn't have to do all the auditioning and the rehearsal, I would be an actor. It's getting the work as an actor. That's the real challenge. But the actual process is just a complete joy. But also acting on the things that I think about and the things that I explore. So taking action on those things in the form of writing, and all the things that I do on the creative side. So I think those 3 words, they're what came to mind. And you said, don't overthink it. So there you go. That's what came to mind. No,
because when we start to overthink it, then we're just like, is that really a good tea? It's like when we make a cup of tea, right? Like the drink that we drink. And we're like, oh, do we put sugar? Do we put milk? Do we put, oh, maybe we should add a little bit more cream. I'm not sure about that. Then we start second guessing, right? So it's like when we serve our tea of life, we overthink stuff too much. So that's why I always tell my guests, don't overthink it. Just give me the words that come to you.
Had you actually asked about tea, in our family, it's iced tea, perfect iced tea. Here you go. You take 3 tea bags, you put them into an ordinary teapot, pour boiling water in, let it steep for a while, ideally till it gets cold. Put it into a half-gallon pitcher with 2/3 of a cup of sugar or your favorite sweetener. Perfect iced tea every time.
Oh my goodness, look at that. See, we even got a recipe tonight from our guest.
It ties back to my parents. That's the way that we made iced tea, and that's still the way that I make iced tea.
Well, I think that's what they call sweet tea, right? Or is it sweet tea when they put it in the sun?
No, that's sun tea. That's another way.
Sun tea.
You just let it brew in the sun. My mom would drink unsweetened iced tea sometimes, but I never liked it. I always wanted that sugar in there.
So do you like hot tea or cold tea?
Iced tea.
Iced tea.
I mean, I drink hot tea, but hot tea was something, growing up in Texas, was something you only got when you were sick, when you were a kid. Iced tea was what we drank at every meal.
See? Not
breakfast, but every other meal.
Yeah, I just like cold tea. Like I started off hot, but I end up drinking it cold. I find it tastes better when it's cold.
Iced tea is the way to go.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to try that recipe. Well, thanks for that recipe, Edward. So I want to get into, you've written over 40, over 50 books. And when we were backstage, you were saying maybe over 60 now.
Yeah, I can't. It
So,
depends on how you count them, but it's something like that.
so out of all of those books, what was the one that gave you the most challenge?
Oh, well, the most challenging ones are the nonfiction books because there's so much more research involved. So I've done a couple of histories. I did a history of the Association of Professional Engineers and Geoscientists of Saskatchewan. Involved a lot of interviewing and looking in archives and things like that. I did a history of the Saskatchewan Land Surveyors Association, which was very similar. Did a history of the Saskatchewan Mining Association. Those are the most difficult books simply because you're researching, you got to get it right because you got a lot of people who actually know what you're writing about. And if you get something wrong, they'll let you know. And also you're usually working with a committee, and working with the committee is always a challenge. So writing fiction is actually the easiest thing, even though writing a novel and getting it right can be difficult. It's a different kind of difficulty. It's more of a challenge of craft as opposed to the actual challenge of the actual work that's involved in researching somebody's history book.
But you wrote a lot of nonfictions. So do you enjoy the research?
Well, it goes back to what I said about exploring and thinking. I do enjoy learning things. I've written books on stuff I never thought I would write. I haven't done one for a long time now, but for a while I was doing quite a few nonfiction books for educational publishers. So, for example, I wrote biographies of Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Johnny Cash, Andy Warhol, the Ayatollah Khomeini. There's, one of these things is not like the others. I did histories on the Iran-Iraq War. I wrote a book about the Mutiny on the Bounty and the movies that have been made about the Mutiny on the Bounty. So that was very interesting. I've written nonfiction books on the universe. I wrote Genetics Demystified. I had to teach myself genetics in order to write that. That was for McGraw-Hill, so a major publisher. So yeah, I actually do very much enjoy the process of learning stuff that goes into writing these nonfiction books that have come my way.
And I like that you say that, do the research, because there is somebody out there that always knows a little bit more, and they're like, you didn't get that right. You didn't do enough homework,
Yeah.
So when people read these nonfictions, they're like, didn't study enough.
I mean, it happens in fiction too. If you're writing anything, especially if you're writing something set in the real world. Most of my fantasy and science fiction is an entirely made up world, but even there, you're running into things like, if you're writing science fiction, you'd better have your physics at least plausible, or they're going to somebody's going to call you on it. So there's a different level going on in fiction than there is in nonfiction.
So we have a question here for you, Edward. What is your biggest challenge writing?
Just getting to it. I'm a terrible procrastinator.
Just getting over that writer's block.
It's not really writer's block. Once I start writing, I can write. I'm a fast writer. The fastest I've ever done anything was one of the ones you have trouble with, The Door into Faerie, the last book in my Shards of Excalibur series. 60,000 words, and I wrote it in 2 weeks flat. So that's about the fastest I've done a complete book. I've done 100,000 words in a month, but first draft. There's still revisions after that. And I've done probably the biggest single chunk. I was on a writing retreat at Banff in the mountains when I was writing one of my books for DAW called Magebane under one of my pseudonyms, Lee Arthur Chane. And that one it was a 150,000 word book, but I did 50,000 words of it in 1 week while I was in the mountains. So once I get started, I can really cook along pretty good. But it's really way too easy to do other things rather than sit down and breaking through that initial. It's almost like there's a membrane you have to push through and then start typing, is the way it feels to me. And some days I don't push through the membrane and I find, oh, look, at least I've got my Facebook profile updated and I posted something on whatever social media, but I didn't actually do any writing. So that is something I struggle with, I think.
So we have another question. What's your biggest book?
The longest one would be the one I just mentioned, Magebane. It's 150,000 words.
So
most of them that I've done for DAW, the contracts are usually for 100,000 words. So I've gotten very good at writing to 100,000 words. And that Shards of Excalibur series, which was YA, I got really good at writing to 60,000 words. I would come in within 1,000 words or so without even really trying. I just made it come out that way. So I have some sort of internal word count thing that tells me when I'm at about the right length. But Magebane was more complex, and it went out to 150,000.
So do you count all your words when you're writing your stories, or do you have like a counter, like a book counter? Like, how does that work? Or your mind just says, you know what, nope, done.
When I'm writing, I'm not really trying to do a certain number of words a day, but it does. If I can do about 2,000 words in 2 hours, so I seem to write about 1,000 words an hour, maybe a little faster if things are really cooking. But yeah, I just look at the counter on Word when I get to the end of the book, and that tells me how long it is. Even though I've been contracted for the ones I've done through DAW Books at 100,000 words, they don't. It's not like that's a hard and fast thing. That's just something to put in the contract. The editors there have always said, my editor, Sheila Gilbert, who's retired now, unfortunately, has always said the book is the length that it needs to be. So Magebane was contracted at 100,000 words and ended up at 150,000. And most of them have gone a little over 100,000, I think.
Wow. And how long does that take you to write?
Well, as I said, the fastest I ever did 100,000 words was in a month. The month of August in 2015, probably. Second book in the Masks of Aygrima series was a trilogy, was Shadows. And I started writing it on August 1st, and I finished it on August 31st, the first draft. So that's more typically, it's probably about 3 months to write the first draft.
And what's your shortest book?
The shortest one I ever wrote was probably the, what was it called? It was a little book about the what is the Milky Way? That's what it was called. And it was a book about, astronomy and black holes and fun stuff like that, but it was written for first to third graders. Oh. So that was the shortest book I've written, I think. Although I also did a picture book called The Adventures of Michael and Mia, Stewards of the Land. And that one might have been shorter. But so it's those really children's books like that, or with lots of illustrations, tend to be the shortest. I think What is the Milky Way was probably the shortest. I have a copy of it over there somewhere.
So do you have a copy of all of your books in the room that you're sitting in right now?
Most. I have boxes and boxes of books because I'm a publisher now too. So I have boxes and boxes of books at another place that we have, which is kind of my storage space. So some of them, they may not be here, but if they're not here, they're over there. I don't think there's anything I've written I don't have one copy of, at least.
Oh, wow.
Maybe some of the computer books I wrote, I don't really care if I still have a copy of using Microsoft PowerPoint 97. I probably do have one somewhere.
We're going way back.
My very first published book was using Microsoft Publisher for Windows 95. That was my first published book.
Yeah, that's way back. That's like the TV where we only have a couple channels and we used to put the SOS pads at the end so the static would stop.
Well, as I said, where I was growing up, we got 2 channels and one of them was fuzzy. And it got better when we got a rotating antenna so we could point it in the direction of the transmitter. But even that wasn't ideal.
Yeah, my dad used to have these big, huge rabbit ears, and he used to put SOS pads on them or tin foil, and he would be like, go and twist them or go and...
Yeah, you were always going like this, hoping that it worked out.
And we did not dare say there's nothing on TV because there's only a few channels to watch. So you watch what was on.
Pretty much.
So I want to get into the shortlisted. So for anybody that doesn't know what that means out there, what does that mean, Edward?
Well, most awards will have announce a short list from which the finalist is drawn. So there's usually about maybe 5 or 6 books that are shortlisted, and then that's nice. I mean, it's an honor just to be nominated. It's like being a finalist for the Academy Awards or the Emmys or something when they say, and the nominees are. That's basically what it is. So usually it depends on the award. In this case of the Saskatchewan Book Awards, there are 2 judges for each category from out of the province, because we're only 1 million people and everybody in the writing community pretty much knows everybody else. So the judges are from out of the province. They go through everything that's submitted, and that's usually, in Saskatchewan, there's probably 90 or 100 books that are submitted every year for the awards. And then they decide whether or not to shortlist them. They also decide who wins. So by the time they announce the shortlist, for those awards, the winner has already been chosen, but you don't find out until the actual awards ceremony. Other awards might work differently. There's the Aurora Awards. I won for Marseguro. I won the Aurora Award for that. And I won another one for my podcast. And I've been nominated, shortlisted a few times. That's a voting process. So fans, science fiction fantasy fans in Canada, can nominate. You have to join the Canadian Science Fiction Fantasy Association, which costs you all of $10. And you can nominate and vote for Canadian science fiction fantasy. So first there's a nomination process, and then the ones that get the most nominations are the ones that make the final list. And then there's a voting process, and people will vote on that final set. So that's a bit different from the juried awards, where typically the jury has already made the decision, but then they put others on the short list. They announce the short list, and then the winner gets announced at whatever the official announcement date is.
So shortlist is pretty much something to celebrate as well.
Oh yeah, I mean, I've been for the Saskatchewan Book Awards. I counted it up this last time, but now I've forgotten. I think I've been shortlisted 12 times, something like that, and I've only ever won once. So I may be, always the bridesmaid, never the bride. I was the bride. I was the bride way back in 2003, but I haven't been a bride since.
So you got married in 2003?
No, I got married in 1997. But I was the bride in that I won the Saskatchewan Book Award in 2002, I guess, not 2003. Just carrying out my metaphor a little too far there.
So I want to get into the book that I was sent from Mickey, The Soul Worm.
I was looking to see if I had one on, but I don't, so I can't hold it up. But you showed the picture anyway.
So what is that book based on?
Soul Worm was the first novel I got published, but certainly not the first one I'd written. I wrote my first novels in high school. I wrote 3 in high school. The first one I tried to submit anywhere came when I was about 20. I started submitting to publishers per se. It was 35. I was 35 when Soul Worm was finally published. So actually 38, I guess, when Soul Worm was finally published. So, I had a long period of time there where I was sending out manuscripts and getting them back and not getting published. I came close a few times. But so I had a lot of them out there, but Soul Worm was the first one that was actually picked up by a publisher, a very minor publisher, but it was published in 1997. And that publisher, the rights came back to me from that publisher. So I decided, since I now have my own publishing company, that I would bring out a new edition. So I went back to that book, which I hadn't looked at in a long time. And speaking of shortlisted, it was my first novel, and it was shortlisted for Best First Book at the Saskatchewan Book Awards the year it came out. So that kind of, and my second book was shortlisted the next year for Best Children's Book. So I kind of, made a bit of a splash as soon as I started getting published, at least locally. I went back through it, and I thought there might be a lot of rewriting to be done, but there really wasn't. I tightened up a passage here and there, and I tweaked this and that, but really I didn't change much at all, just a little copy edit. And I also didn't change the time frame, the time setting. Soul Worm is set in Weyburn, Saskatchewan, where I used to live, but it's a fantasy in that there's an alternate world with the same topography as Weyburn, Saskatchewan, and something comes through from that world into our world, a soul worm. You can think of it as a demon. And then this sort of young priestess from that world also comes through. Only her mind. None of these things are physical. They're just disembodied. She comes through. And so the soul worm ends up possessing this young woman as teenager in Weyburn. And the priestess ends up inside the head of another young woman, the best friend of the one who's been possessed. But at first she can't do anything. She can't even communicate with the girl she's in. So this girl, you see part of it through her eyes, and she sees that her friend is acting really strange because the soul worm is trying to build up to some explosion of violence, because that's what it feeds on, is violence and hatred and all that stuff. And if it can get to a certain level, a certain explosion of violence, it will be able to reproduce, and then it will run rampant over the earth and end of the world scenario kind of things. And so that was the premise. It was all set in 1980s in Weyburn, and because that's when I wrote it. And then it wasn't published till 1997. But when I went back and looked at it, I thought, you know what? Stranger Things is out there, and people like stuff set in the 80s. So I didn't see any reason to change it. I left it set in the 1980s. There's some advantages to that from a writing fantasy and science fiction point of view, in that you don't have to deal with cell phones and texting. Because if you think about things like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, there's so many of those stories that wouldn't work if they'd only been able to text each other. Oh, I'm in the library and there's a vampire attacking. But they couldn't communicate. And so that's the only way those stories work. And that's kind of similar for Soulworm. So I decided it was nice to leave it set then. I didn't have to update anything. And yeah, I was just happy to get it out, and hopefully it'll find a few more readers. Also, I hated the original cover, so I was able to put a cover on it that I liked much more.
So how did you come up with the cover?
I had an image in mind. That cover is a mixture of AI and stock images. It's a composite of several things, but I was able to create the image that I had in my head, and I think it worked out pretty well. It's just a teenager with she's wearing sunglasses, and you can see flames in the sunglasses. She's watching something burn, and that ties in very much with the way that you fight the soulworms is with fire. So that's I just like the image, and then I used a Stranger Things font for the title. So.
I was always trying, when I was doing the research on this book, I was trying to understand why the fire in the glasses were. But like you just said, the fire was what destroyed the soul worm.
Yeah, but it's also something that almost destroys my main character. So in my head, the girl on the front is the one that has the soul worm in her head. And she's watching this farmhouse that she has set on fire with her friend who has the priestess in her head inside it. So that's what I think is going on in that image.
So Edward, is it almost something like Stranger Danger? Because it's almost like the identity, the what word am I looking here for? The species goes into the body, right? In Stranger Danger.
It's basically demon possession, but it's not a demon, but it's the same kind of idea. It has more of a, from my point of view, it's actually it's fantasy, but also almost a science fiction background. I think of this thing more like an alien than I do anything else. But it does come across as fantasy and magic. So I think I'm a fantasy writer with science fiction roots. So I'm always finding in the back of my head, there's always kind of a science fictional explanation for the magic that I'm doing on the front in the story.
So in a lot of your books, Edward, is there a lot of transporting from bodies? Like, do you...
No, I think that's the only one that has people inside other people's heads, I think.
So your other books, what kind of science fiction are they based on? Aliens?
Everything. I mean, going back to the beginning, my first published one was Soulworm. My second one was The Dark Unicorn, which is straightforward fantasy set in a world with magic. The Dark Unicorn is not even a unicorn. It's just a carving of a unicorn. There are no unicorns in the book. That one's kind of funny because the title came from my niece long time ago now. We were looking, it's so long ago that these movies were on RCA video disc, not on tape or on DVD or anything like that. And I had a collection of them, and what would you like to watch? And two of them I had were The Last Unicorn and The Dark Crystal, and she got them mixed up and said, let's watch The Dark Unicorn. And I wrote a book because of that title that she put in my head. So that's where that came from. But that's straightforward fantasy. Then after that, it's straightforward science fiction. Andy Nebula, Interstellar Rock Star. So that's far future space, but also involved music and performing. It's aliens and drugs and rock and roll in the far future. That's what that one is. And then my first novels for DAW were both science fiction. Marseguro and Terra Insegura are far future. They have genetically modified humans. There's no aliens in there. Then I went to fantasy with Magebane, which has magic, but again, there aren't even any monsters or anything in that one. It's just some people have magic and some people don't have magic. And there's also a steampunk element because there's airships and things in that one. Masks of Aygrima was straightforward fantasy with, but an interesting magic system where magic is something that adheres to ore that you mine from the ground. So they're actually magic mines where you mine magic, and only some people can use the magic and others can't. And everybody's masked at the age of 15, and that's where the title comes from. So that the autarch, the ruler, can see, his guards can look at your mask and see if you're a threat or not. So you have to wear a mask all the time. Then I went back to science fiction for the Cityborn, which is science fiction, but no aliens. So I don't even have aliens in a lot of my. I forgot Lost in Translation was actually my first DAW book. It did have aliens in it. It was lots of aliens. It had winged aliens. It had tentacled aliens. It had all kinds of aliens.
So he does have aliens, guys.
I have had some aliens, but actually I don't even do a lot of aliens now that I think about it. Mostly it's humans in space in my books. Now in the most recent one, The Tangled Stars, was far future science fiction with an AI, artificially intelligent, uplifted, genetically modified talking cat, who becomes a starship captain. So that's the most recent one. Oh. He's not an alien, but he's not human either. So I guess he's kind of an alien.
So Edward, do you ever amaze yourself with some of the stuff you write?
I don't know. It just comes naturally to me. That's just where my head goes. I've written very little that's not fantastical in some fashion. And when I have, it's like, well, this is kind of boring. Can't we throw an alien in here? Like the nonfiction, well, that's one thing. But I mentioned a book called The Adventures of Michael and Mia, Stewards of the Land. That's actually probably the book of mine that has more copies printed than anything else, because it was for for Agriculture Week. And it was published in provinces across Canada, and then many copies were printed. It went into schools, and there was politicians would go in and read from this book. And it was all about these two kids who are trying to grow a garden and learning about farming and what's involved at the same time. And it was illustrated by Val Lawton was her name, who's a artist here in Saskatchewan, I think. So that was fun. But I kept thinking, could we throw in an alien or something?
Could we not just throw something in there?
Yeah, farming, crop circles. We could have had crop circles. It was farming.
Right? Or you could have had an alien planting the beans. Yeah.
So that's just where my head goes. So, but I switch easily between science fiction and fantasy, and horror, and there's usually something fantastical going on when I tell a story.
So I want to talk to you now about your publishing company.
Shadow Paw Press.
Yeah, let's talk about that a bit. So how did that start?
I started Shadow Paw Press in 2018. I had two books I wanted to self-publish. One was a collection of my short fiction. I haven't written a lot of short stories, but I had enough finally that I could put out a collection. But it's hard to sell. If you're not a well-known short fiction writer, it's hard to sell that sort of thing. So, well, I'll just put it out myself. Paths to the Stars. And then I also had my grandfather-in-law's, this is his house that we live in. They bought it in 1939. It was built in 26. His name was Sampson J. Goodfellow, and he was a First World War veteran. And late in life, he wrote his memoirs of his First World War experiences. And they were in the house here, and I'd looked at them. I put them online, but I always thought they'd make a good book. I didn't really edit them when I put them online. I just kind of typed them up, and scanned them, and put them on. And so I wanted to get that out in time for the centennial of the armistice in 2018. And so I'll just self-publish those. But then I was talking to somebody I'd worked with on one of the nonfiction books. In fact, you mentioned it, the History of Government House. And she said, no, start your own publishing company. And foolishly, I listened. So I started Shadow Paw Press. And at first, it was those two books. And then because I have metaphorically killed a lot of publishers, like the Shards of Excalibur books were published by Coteau Books. They've gone under. I have a couple of science fiction novels were published by Bundoran Press. They're gone. Flames of Nevyana that you mentioned, that publisher went out of business. So all those books came back to me, and I wanted to get them out there. And Soulworm eventually I got to. So that was my first focus, was quite a bit on my own stuff. But also I guess it was in 2019, at the annual meeting of Sask Books, which is the Association of Saskatchewan Publishers. I'm now vice president. At the annual meeting, they brought in somebody from Winnipeg, a publisher who had successfully kickstarted an anthology. She had raised a lot of money. She had comic connections, and comic people are really big on Kickstarters. And I thought, I know some authors, because also in 2018, I'd started my own podcast, The Worldshapers, where I talked to other science fiction and fantasy authors about the creative process. And I talked to some of the biggest names in the field. So I reached out and said, would you be interested in being in an anthology? And 18 of them said yes. And so I successfully kickstarted an anthology in March of 2020 when nothing else was happening in the world. But it worked. It funded, and I've now done it 4 times. But that was another book now that I put out through Shadowpaw Press. And then I had this bright idea to, I could do new editions of notable previously published works. So what has evolved now is that I'm publishing original work by other people. I'm publishing reprints of books, many of them award winners or by people who are major authors. I'm doing reprints of those. I now have an editorial board that submissions are coming in and I'm bouncing them off of them. And so I'm becoming this very big operation, but it's still only me and Shadowpaw because it's named after the cat and he's no help. I think I'm up
He's resting all the time.
Yeah. I think I'm up to either in the works or published. I've got over 30 books now, and only a handful of them are mine. The last one that I put out that was mine was Soulworm. Then before that, I had Star Song, which is the only original book of mine that I put out, except for the short fiction collection, the only one of mine that I published myself, as opposed to, I still have books out looking for other publishers as well. But I published one called Star Song, which was my very first attempt at being published way back in the 90s. And I came very close to being published. That book came very close to being published in the 90s, but it didn't. And I went back to it. That one I did rewrite extensively. I brought it out last year, and it was shortlisted for an Aurora Award for Best Young Adult Novel. And then this year it was shortlisted for a Saskatchewan Book Award for Best Young Adult Novel. So it made me feel good because that book was something that has been sitting in my, you always talk about trunk. I don't actually have a trunk, but sitting around on the hard drive somewhere waiting for something to happen for a long time. And it finally came out and it got some attention, which was nice. But again, that was something I could put out. The advantage of having my own publishing company for myself is if I can't find a home for something of mine, I now have a place to publish it with proper distribution and everything else. So it's a step up from, just throwing an ebook up on Amazon. Although some of those ebooks on Amazon are selling way more copies than what I'm publishing, but hey.
Yeah, but it's almost like, social media, people buying followers and subscribers, Yeah. Are people really reading these books? That's what I always wonder. Like, are you actually reading the book or are you just buying, when you did a 99-cent sale, are people really just paying the 99 cents support, here's your support and the book goes on the shelf.
Yeah, it's very imponderable to know exactly what's going on.
So you mentioned Kickstarters, Edward. So for the viewers out there that don't know what Kickstarter is, could you share a little bit on that?
It's crowdsourcing. So and Kickstarter is just one of them, but it's probably the best known. You set a goal for how much money you'd like to raise. It takes a lot of work to set one of these up, especially with all the authors I have involved. But you set a goal, you decide what rewards you will get for certain levels, and you have to figure that out so that you're actually bringing in money and not spending more money on the rewards that you're making from the goal. And then you can set it. It's usually a month. You run this Kickstarter and you promote it, and people can go and can pledge money. They don't pay anything up front. They just pledge it. And once you reach your goal, you fund it, and then you get the money. And you can keep funding. It can keep funding way past your goal. So there's usually things called stretch goals, where if I raise an extra $5,000, I'll do something else that I didn't, I couldn't do originally. Mine have raised about $15,000 Canadian for the anthologies each year, which is actually a bit less than I need, but I make it happen because it's that whole long tail thing. The anthologies will keep selling. They're always selling a few copies day after day, month after month. And, over time, they will make money. But that's it. And so it's a way for people to who are excited about something new that's being developed, something creative. And it's not just books are part of it, but people do comics, people do, well, actually this light that's shining on the side of my head was a Kickstarter project that I backed. And I received this, it's not a light, it's actually a scanner on a stand. So you can scan books very easily by putting it down and turning the pages. So there's all sorts of things being Kickstarted all the time. It's really interesting when you get into it.
Oh, well, for all the viewers and listeners out there, we had one that asked what Kickstarter was, so that's why I had asked you that question. I want to get into the cartoonists. So do you do cartoons or?
I did. I don't do them now, but I was
Okay.
an editorial cartoonist at the Weyburn Review for several years while I worked there. There's a in the basement, and I keep meaning to get them out and look at them. I'd probably be horrified by them. There's because my mother clipped everything that was in the newspaper with my name on it. For all the years I was reporter, and even when I was editor of the newspaper, she was still clipping my clippings and saving them for me. So I've got, which is great. Now I have boxes. Everything I ever did at the Weyburn Review is in a box in the basement, and hopefully it hasn't been eaten by something or crumbled into dust. But all those cartoons are down there. So I did minor in art in university, and I really enjoyed it, but I wasn't terrific at it. I don't think I have the patience for it.
Okay.
The fine work. However, with the new anthology, the latest anthology, I do have a niece who's a very good artist. She illustrated my poetry book that I put out a few years ago, my science fiction fantasy poetry book. And going back to the Kickstarter, that one of the stretch goals was to have the book illustrated. And she's sent me all the illustrations now. I managed to raise enough money to be able to pay her for that. So this anthology is going to be illustrated, but tempting though it was to think I could have illustrated it, I know very well that my artistic skills would not impress anyone had I attempted to do so.
Well, I from your bio, I got that you're a singer, you're an actor, you're a publisher, you're an editor, you're a writer. So I was
Anything for a buck. Actually,
right.
far too much of that stuff is done for free, but
So Edward, what I did find is that you're into opera.
I have sung opera. When I first quit my job 30 years ago now, this fall, one reason I knew I could do it was because I had an invitation to take part in a school tour with Prairie Opera out of Saskatoon. So for 3 years, I did these school tours with Prairie Opera. I did small bits. We used to have an opera company here in Regina that did a few things, but most of it was with Prairie Opera. But yeah, I did opera. But I've done more musical theater than opera.
And you're also a part of a choir, are you not?
I've been part of many choirs. I've sung with the Canadian Chamber Choir, which is a national auditioned group. Again, not recently. I was always one of the oldest people in there, and I think I've aged out from their point of view. Although it's funny because they started as an outgrowth of the National Youth Choir, and they had this sort of thing, informal rule that nobody could be in the Canadian Chamber Choir who was over 30, but then that original group of people went over 30, and somehow that rule just kind of went over to the side. But anyway, I've sung with them. I'm currently singing with a group called Wascana Voices, which is a high-end self-directed choir here in Regina. I used to sing with one called Prairie Chamber Choir. So yeah, my dad was a choir director, and as I said, I sang in church growing up, and in his choruses growing up, and in university I sang in a chorus. So choral music has always been something I've really enjoyed.
And you used to be on CBC TV.
CBC and radio, yeah. Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, that's our national broadcasting corporation. And yeah, I was on the afternoon edition radio program here in Regina for 17 years, doing a science column every week where I talked about the science of everyday things. And for a couple of years, I was also on a national TV program called What on Earth, doing something similar. So yeah, I've done that. I've hosted my own TV program, my own radio program, host a podcast now. It's The Voice, you see.
So when you were on the radio, was it music or was it a DJ? Like, did you have your own talk show? How
It was basically an interview show like this. There were 3 of us, I think, that originally started it. And in my head, I ended up doing it longer than anybody else. But it was interviewing people about arts-related things, music and dance and theater and all that sort of stuff on local community radio. And then the TV show I hosted was called Net Talk, and it was a computer program that about 10 years I did that, a phone-in show. But that was funny because I was basically just the traffic controller, because I had the real computer guys sitting. Sometimes there was one on either side of me, so it'd be, "Oh, that's a very interesting question, Bob," that sort of thing. And then Bob would answer the question because I didn't know.
So it was really engaging radio talk show.
Yeah.
So we're almost at the end here. We got 5 minutes left. So I want to get into, I asked you your favorite color and you gave me red. So why red?
I'm not even sure that's true, but that's what came to mind. And you don't want to think about it too much. I don't know. It's warm. It's exciting. It's vibrant. and it stands out in a crowd, and you'll make bulls chase you across the across the pasture.
Run.
So it gets you exercise as well.
And I also asked you, Edward, what one word to describe yourself, and you gave me the word curious.
Well, I think that goes back to what I said at the T, the thinking and exploring. I'm just curious about everything. I want to know everything about everything. And I know I can't, so that's really annoying. But although some people would say that I pretend I know everything about everything. I
just see you as this curious George monkey.
Something like that, yeah. Goes back to being that kid that always said, I read somewhere that.
So what message would you have for anybody out there that would like to become a science fiction or fantasy writer?
It's the same. The only advice, and it's the same advice and has been forever, is read. You have to read. You have to read science fiction, fantasy. Watching the media, it's not the same as written science fiction, fantasy. There are people that get into writing from watching, the TV shows and stuff, but often the TV shows are based on stuff that was written a long time ago. So you have to read, and then you have to write. I mean, there's no two ways about it. You read, and then you try to do what you have seen and what you've read, and do it yourself. And you write, 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 and you write. You learn to do by doing. And everything, and writing is, I think it's Stephen King has said in his book on writing, which I highly recommend. It may have been in there, where you have to write about 500,000 words before you write anything that's really publishable. He just picked that number out of thin air, but I certainly wrote at least that many before I actually sold anything.
So what is your favorite science fiction movie?
Of all time?
Of all time.
Well, of all time, it has to be Star Wars. That just blew me away when I saw it back in my college days.
What is it about Star Wars?
It was the first movie that really captured believably what was in our head from reading science fiction. I mean, Star Trek on TV was one thing, but the special effects were so, even for the 60s, they were fine, but they were what they were. But in Star Wars, we were seeing things that we would never have believed we could ever have seen on the screen. Now, these days, of course, one of the great things about computer-generated imagery is that I'm watching, things like Foundation and Dune and things like that, and the various Star Wars TV shows and superhero shows, and One Piece right now we're watching, and all that's a lot of that stuff is computer generated. You can put anything on the screen. So we're used to that kind of spectacle, and you don't, oh yeah, there's an ancient city that's 300 stories tall, and there's our guy flying down from the top, oh yeah, sure, whatever. But when we saw it in Star Wars, we had never seen anything like that, and that's what really, I must have seen that movie a dozen times even before I had a recording of it. So.
And who was your favorite character? Someone wants to know.
In Star Wars? Well, I liked Han Solo, but I probably related to Luke.
And he's the
main character. That's not too surprising.
I'm trying to go back.
Although I had a friend who really was into Darth Vader, so hey.
I think the one that I liked was R2-D2.
Oh, well, yeah. If you're going to go into the robots, well, sure. R2-D2 is everybody's favorite robot.
I just found that he was always asking these questions, right?
Well, he mostly went, beep, 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 beep. C-3PO was the one who talked.
Yeah. Oh, that's the one. Yeah. R2-D2 was the little robot that beep, 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 beep. And
he's the animated trash can.
I understand his language. Yes. Because there's got to be some meaning behind that beep, 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 So Edward, I want to really thank you for joining me on Tea Time tonight. I want to thank the viewers and listeners out there. We could not do this without all of you guys out there. So Edward, thank you for sharing your tea tonight. It was really fun getting to know you and getting to know science fiction and just going down the flow and getting some recipes. We got some tea recipes tonight. So if you want to make iced tea, the recipe is on the Tea Time. Go back and watch the replay. push hashtag replay. Let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you'd like to see more Tea Times, check out Miss Liz's website, www.misslizsteatime.com. Edward, before we leave, where can people reach you?
I'm at edwardwillett.com is my website. I'm on Twitter at X at eWillett, Instagram at Edward Willett Author, Facebook at edward.willett, and on YouTube at Edward Willett. And on YouTube, you can walk around my hometown of Regina with me. I do live stream walks almost every day.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that. So if anybody would like to do a walk with Edward, check that YouTube channel. I'll give it a quick subscribe. And if you do grab a book, leave a review because that does help the authors out there. So again, thank you again, Edward, for tuning in. Thank you, Mickey Mickelson from Creative Edge, for giving me this incredible guest tonight. I had a blast. And I will see everybody next Thursday, same time, same place, with 3 new TEAs and 3 new stories. And we just never know where Miss Liz is going to travel to next.